Now, I want to just take us back a little step in history and talk about the abolition of slavery, because there are lessons we can learn from that and which actually tie in very cogently with what happened in Cancun this year and what's happening within the wider context of political engagement on climate change. So 200 years ago, we had 300 companies who were trading in slaves, and there were 6 million slaves. 6 million slaves were out in the marketplace within a period of just 30 years. Here in the UK, William Wilberforce was the man who decided to take up the mantle of abolition of slavery. And he recognized very early on there was absolutely no point going around all those who had the 6 million slaves and asking that they use their slaves a little less. That's akin to energy efficiency, because ultimately slaves were human energy. What he realized that, in fact, had to be done was about going upstream and turning off the tap where the flow of slaves were coming through. Now, of course, when he proposed 3 things that needed to be done. First of all, pool the subsidies. Slavery was heavily subsidized back then, as was the first monocrop plantations, sugar plantations, heavily reliant on slaves. And it was the British taxpayer who paid for it. And what we had there was Wilberforce saying, pool the subsidies. Make it illegal, make it a crime to trade in slaves. And thirdly, give new subsidies to innovation in the other direction. So in other words, it's not about closing down the corporations, but making the problem part of the solution and closing the door very definitely to the avenue that they shouldn't be going down. Now, of course, industry objected heavily to this. And there were 300 companies back then, and they argued it would lead to economic collapse. Public demand it, it's a necessity. Now, those arguments we hear today within the context of the most damaging polluters of all, and that's the fossil fuel industry. So what industry proposed back then was eerily similar to today. Limit numbers, so therefore place a cap on the amount of slaves that they would trade in. Leave it to us within the market to create an internal trade of those. So a cap and trade system was in effect proposed. Give us tradable permits within that. And legislation, we don't want it. It's too burdensome. But if you absolutely must, then put in place what I call catch me if you can legislation. Impose fines if they exceed it if you catch us. Self-regulation was what everyone ultimately wanted. And of course they said, let us use them more efficiently. We'll tell people to use their slaves a little less. In fact, we know from the 19th century, a gentleman called Jevons, who expounded the theory of Jevons' paradox, that if you use something and create more efficient means, you end up using more. We know that. We see that with cars. Make your car more efficient, more people buy more cars, and we drive further. Same with light bulbs. So improving conditions was never really ultimately going to do it. The difference between then and now is that instead of 300 companies, it's 3,000 companies that have been identified under the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report that came out earlier this year. They identified the top 3,000 companies that are creating the most destruction to the planet. And what we're seeing is the difference is, instead of laughing at those proposals, as was done by the British government 200 years ago, on the international stage, we've applied those proposals, and they're not working, and we know that. So the T report identified that in 2008, those top 3,000 corporations have caused $2.2 trillion of damage and destruction to the environment. That's exceeded only by 5 nations' GDPs. 2009, we're looking at 4 trillion. 2010, it's expected again to double. So this really is exponentially going in the wrong direction, and we need to move very, very fast. The UN say that ecosystems are at a tipping point, and we're at risk of rapid degradation and collapse. And if we're looking at this current trajectory that our governments are putting us on, then we have huge problems. President Evo Morales said that the deal in Cancun is tantamount to our government signing up and committing ecocide, and he's correct. Now, I'm the lawyer who's proposed into the United Nations that we make ecocide a crime. The irony is that in this day and age, you can do a runner from a black cab and you're looking at 2 years imprisonment. The head of a corporation can do a runner from destroying the planet, and he can do it without consequence, or she. Now, the thing is that the current laws we have are not fit for purpose. They're predicated on fines, and they're levied against what is known in law the artificial persons, and that is the corporations. Unless we put in an international umbrella law of a crime like genocide called ecocide, only then can we actually address individuals and impose what's called a preemptive obligation on individuals not to go down that avenue. And I leave you with this example. Imagine, if you will, I'm a CEO of an energy company, and you are my directors. And the international crime of ecocide has been put in place. So I'm sitting with you, I'm saying, well, ladies and gentlemen, what are we to do here? If I'm to go in and extract oil from the Athabasca tar sands, which is possibly the largest ecocide on the planet, and is 5 times more energy intensive, greenhouse gas intensive, toxic and damaging to the environment, I'm at risk of going to prison, as are you, all of my directors. In fact, our shareholders will not support criminal activity. Moreover, we have a problem. Those banks will no longer finance damaging and destructive activity. They will no longer finance criminal activity. And that head of state will no longer put in policies that uphold criminal activity. So what we do is we close the door to go down one avenue, and that energy company will suddenly be looking at being the solution and rapidly creating innovation in the other direction to be the clean energy company rather than the dirty energy company. So David King says that this will be remembered as a century of resource wars. What we have here is a hermetically sealed cycle that we need to break. Damage, destruction, or loss leads to ecocide. That is resource depletion. That leads to conflict, ultimately war, more and more. It's about turning off that stream upstream, that tap upstream. This is my last slide. What this ultimately comes down to is 2 divergent approaches to the planet. View the planet as an inert thing, and what you do is you impose the value. You put a price on it. You commoditize it. You use it. You abuse it. That is governed by property laws. The whole of the climate negotiations is predicated on what you see on the screen on the left-hand side. It's about creating carbon permits to pollute. Whose interests ultimately are we protecting here? Look at the other side, and what we have is a very different approach. That's about acknowledging and recognizing that the planet is a living being, recognizing the intrinsic value, and that's about taking responsibility. That's all about trusteeship law, but it's also about putting in place a mechanism that has a kick, something that ultimately closes the door and prohibits the damage and destruction to this planet. Ban Ki-moon, I heard him speak in Cancun, and he informed a room twice the size of this that every second of every minute of every day, we lose a football pitch's worth of forest. That means we really should be making that a crime. And instead, all they've done is tried to commoditize it. We, as the people, need to call upon our leaders to put in place solutions that come from that space on that screen, not from property laws, not from protecting the interests of just a few, but protecting the wider Earth community. Thank you very much.